thank you everybody for joining us today. My name is Russell Paul. I'm the Regional Director for LogPoint for the UK and Ireland. So today we're going to run through just a brief overview of the LogPoint solution, give a good understanding of how the actual architecture works, and then run a demo of the technology as well. I also have one of my colleagues, Niels, on the call. So hello, Niels.
Hello.
Who will be running a demo for us. So this is a specific presentation around LogPoint SIEM solution, including the UEBA functionality for the NHS. So we've pulled together some specific offerings for the NHS for LogPoint, really in recognition of the requirements we're seeing for the NHS to have a SIEM solution, especially with the requirement around the data security and protection toolkit, and really putting something in place that allows for a fit-for-purpose solution into the NHS, which is a realistic price that's actually very predictable as well, giving the ability to actually have the right functionality and align to obviously the budget constraints we're seeing inside the NHS as well. So we'll go through that as well today. I will say, if anyone has any questions, obviously we haven't got any ability to actually speak on this, but we will have a Q&A session at the end of the webinar, which can actually run on as long as needed. But there is a Q&A button on Zoom as well, so please click on that and write some questions. If we can answer as we go through, we will do, and any ones we don't get round to, we'll actually cover at the end of the session. So I'll get started. So first, again, thank you everyone for joining. So obviously we're here today to talk about SIEM, or Security Incident and Event Management. So what we're talking about here is actually grabbing your information across your environment from a log file perspective and pulling that into a central platform, which allows us then to convert all these log files into a single language, a single taxonomy, and actually allows us to actually then create some very specific searches, dashboards, alerts and such like, to actually give you full visibility across your estate from a security perspective, allowing you to actually have valuable alerts and meaningful dashboards, but also to drill into that information and actually do analysis and threat hunting as well. What we see in the market today is that most organisations, especially NHS, have a multitude of systems from a security perspective across their estate. So everything from your firewalls to your AV to your two-factor authentication to your DLP, but also things like Windows servers and Linux servers, Office 365 and such like. And each of these different environments obviously has different management interfaces, different skill sets required to actually understand the information it's presenting, and obviously different ways of looking at the log files. And it provides a siloed view across your environment where you have to go into each of the individual environments to actually understand what's going on. It's very difficult to actually cross-reference those across the environments. And this is where a SIEM solution really adds value. By pulling everything into one location, we're able to actually see that from a clear dashboard, a clear viewpoint to actually make decisions against and actually drill down and actually understand the information that's actually affecting the entire environment. We see in most environments that the data volumes are actually increasing quite dramatically as well, and that's no different for the NHS. So on average, every 18 months to 2 years, the actual volume of the log files is doubling in size as we see more and more connected devices, more and more ways of actually utilising that data, and now we're seeing more and more machine-to-machine activity generating more logs as well. And it's really utilising solutions like LogPoint to be able to understand, in the multitude of data we're receiving, what's important, how can we understand the things that really matter, and how do we actually understand them to actually react in the right way. From a LogPoint perspective, there's 3 key areas we focus on. So primarily around security, and this is around providing visibility across the entire estate from a security perspective to give that insight. But because we're actually looking at the entirety of the data, it's also very simple to actually do some clever reporting against compliance standards. So whether that be GDPR or ISO 27001 or things like PCI, we can actually pull that data in and actually look at that as against the requirements of these standards and provide very clear management reporting, but also do the gap analysis and the due diligence that's actually required to maintain these standards as well. And the last thing about LogPoint, it's not necessarily just about security. So we will, in theory, take logs from virtually anything. So the ability to pull logs in from any operational environment as well gives us greater capabilities. And that could be as simple as pulling logs from your print servers, so you can understand if someone's actually printing vast amounts of coloured paper every day and costing a lot of money, or it could be something more specific to NHS, like medical equipment and such like. As long as we have access to logs and we can actually get access to actually the terminology of those logs, so we can convert it into the LogPoint language, we can actually provide some insights around those kind of technologies as well. So if we look at the NHS, so as part of the kind of package we pulled together for the NHS, we've obviously done some in-depth research around what's really driving the need and what we're seeing from our customers and from our prospect customers around what they need and what's kind of challenges they have in the market. So obviously there's lots of information out there. There's lots of detail around how digital transformation is happening inside the NHS to make us more efficient, to make us more online, to make us more able to deal with the increasing workloads that we're seeing. And with that, things like electronic medical records are being used. We're seeing more and more technology now integrated into the medical equipment across the NHS as well, which means they're on the networks, and there's more and more data coming from these as well, which obviously brings more capability, more functionality from this kind of equipment. With it brings more risks as well, with the increased complexity. With the NHS, it's quite unique. So it's not just around cyber attacks disrupting service or defacing a website. It's actually more critical than that. So we're talking about life and death in some situations. And obviously we need to make sure that our environments are secure, but also when the worst does happen, we have the visibility and the ability to react quickly. And I guess hopefully everyone will agree on the call. There's a lot being asked of the IT function inside the NHS at the moment. So we're seeing obviously lots of change, lots of new transformation going on. The kind of migration to Windows 10 rollouts, and all being kind of undertaken with a scaled down team. So the team inside NHS IT departments tends to be multitasking on a regular basis. And any tools, any systems that are actually put in place is about actually making efficiencies, making sure we can do more with less rather than actually adding overheads. And lastly, we see obviously a massive uptake in the compliance as well, aligned to the NHS, to make sure that that we're actually addressing the concerns and doing things in a productive manner. Like everyone in the UK, we have the GDPR to worry about, which obviously brings in some added complexity around the way we manage data and the way we react to breaches. But obviously specific to the NHS, we see the Data Security and Protection Toolkit requirements, which actually outlines numerous requirements to actually adhere to. One of which is around log management, and one of which really kind of digs into the requirements for actually how that's done and how the data is managed. One of the things we'll do after the call is share some documentation we pulled together around where LogPoint aligns to DSPT and how we can help you achieve the accreditation you need. Obviously, there's ongoing discussions around the Cyber Essentials Plus and how that's required inside the NHS. I think it's still debatable if that's actually a requirement for 2021, but obviously something that a lot of environments are actually pushing towards. We see things like the NCSC CAF requirements now really kind of driving extra requirements inside the actual IT teams to actually adhere to certain standards. And I'm told as well now the CQC now has a cyber element of it as well, which means there's more auditing going on around cyber. So with all this, obviously it's a unique environment inside the NHS, but one that's quite challenging, one that's constantly changing, and something that's that kind of a visible ability to actually kind of look across the entire environment and react quickly is a necessity, really. So focusing on security, what we hear about it from a SIEM perspective is centralized analysis. So there's always a phrase, love it or loathe it, called a single pane of glass. It's actually very descriptive what this is about. It's about giving that overarching view across the environments, but also that ability to really drill into that, to actually do that analysis, to do that threat hunting where required, to actually give you the ability to act quickly and with as much information as possible. In the UK market, we still have around about a 2.5 month time between a breach happening and someone actually detecting that something's going on or something's potentially disrupting an environment. And with these technologies, it's all around actually reducing that time frame from months down to kind of days, hours, and minutes. And obviously, with the lovely GDPR, we now have this 72-hour window when we actually detect a breach to actually really understand what's happened. But also what's caused it, how did it actually come about, what's been affected, and also what we're going to do about it, how we are going to react. And 72 hours is not a massive amount of time, especially if we have to look at multiple systems, understand exactly how they relate to each other, what's happened, and try and pull this information together. And what we're saying here is with this kind of a SIEM technology, it allows you to do that from a central location, obviously being more proficient, but also a lot quicker as well. The other thing we say around a SIEM technology, and LogPoint's no different, and really any security technologies, is they're only ever going to be as good as the configuration that's actually placed upon them. So one of the things that LogPoint are very proud about is that with all our connectors, all our interfaces into different technologies we pull logs from, we actually build dashboards, reports, and alerts that come with these pre-built. So it's very, very quick, very easy to actually get the system up and running and have some very relevant use cases aligned to it. But that also provides the ability to actually tailor those very simply, to actually make them more aligned, to join them together, to make them specific to your environment so they can actually be as relevant as possible. But even with all this, even with the right configuration, there's always going to be certain situations where we just don't know. We wouldn't necessarily know to actually pre-configure our devices to search to actually alert us about these things, which is why we actually released the LogPoint UEBA module around about 18 months ago to really address this unknown area. The ability to really understand things that maybe wouldn't necessarily have the hindsight or the foresight, I should say, to actually look into prior to them happening. So what we do with UEBA is we actually align this across the SIEM environment as an additional license that sits on top of the core SIEM product. And we align it to individual users or machines. We actually take the data out of the SIEM, we encrypt that and put into our cloud UEBA module, which actually allows us to actually run some very clever analytics and very clever machine learning algorithms to give us a baseline around what normal is for that user or machine. And by doing so, it takes around about 30 days to get that baseline. Once we have that, we're then very easy to actually understand when there's things outside the normal, when there's things that maybe aren't aligned to how we see this user working on a typical day-to-day basis. And that could be someone logging in at 4 a.m. in the morning. It could be someone transferring files to the internet that maybe they don't usually do, or accessing servers in unusual ways. And in individual cases, maybe these wouldn't warrant an alert. So someone logging at 4 a.m. might indicate that maybe they can't sleep and they're checking their emails. However, because it's unusual information, unusual activity, we can just elevate the risk score slightly. And if we see multitude of these kind of things happening, which might be indicative to someone doing some malicious activity, that risk score gets increased and increased until we hit a threshold and we can alert. And this gives us really good insights into things that maybe we wouldn't even know we should be looking for. And it is a very, very powerful solution. So just a quick overview of LogPoint. LogPoint is a European organization based out of, headquartered out of Copenhagen. Obviously, we have offices throughout Europe. We are very much a European-focused organization. We do have offices over in North America and across in Asia as well. We are on the Gartner Magic Quadrant. In fact, we are the only visionary solution on the quadrant today, and we are the only technology that is EAL 3+ certified. Whilst that's not specifically relevant to the NHS, it allows us to be used by a kind of central government and things like NATO. But it also gives you the assurance that we've gone through quite a lengthy process to accredit our technology, and it kind of gives the assurances that we've actually proved that we actually built and maintained in a secure manner as well. For me, on this slide here, the most important part of this is the advanced modern SIEM. So what we're saying here is we've looked at around how SIEM's viewed in the market, and to be honest, SIEM is actually not got a very good name for itself. It's seen as very, very expensive. It's seen as something that takes a very long time to get operational, sometimes months, even years to get fully functional. And then once you have it up and running, you need kind of dedicated resource to really get the most out of the solution. And LogPoint's really been built from the ground up to address those three things. So first of all, we think the commercial model is really aligned and really predictable, allowing you to actually kind of have a solution that meets the needs from a commercial perspective. Secondly, the time to value on the solution is actually very quick. Typically a 5-day installation will actually get you operational, but not only that, will also make sure you actually have a system that's working and you know how to use. And lastly, the actual system is extremely intuitive. It's extremely easy to understand how to actually leverage it, to use it, to modify it, which means that you're there to actually get the most out of the product, to actually add those efficiencies you can actually kind of gain from technologies like this to actually give that visibility, rather than having dedicated skill sets required to actually kind of be trained to the nth degree to use it. From a Gartner perspective, there's also, if you are looking at this kind of technology, please do look at the peer insights. This is an independent review done by people leveraging or utilizing SIEM technology, where they go in and actually put reviews, much like a TripAdvisor kind of model, of what their experiences have been. Please look at that. Look at obviously how our competition is leveraged. We're very proud of our customer reviews on here. And in addition, there is another format as well, another document which we can share with you around a company called Infotech, who've done an independent review of the market. This gives some really good insight into the kind of things that you should potentially be asking from a SIEM, and how the various technologies kind of align to that as well. So one other thing, I guess, is always a concern around any new software solutions or any requirements, especially when we're talking about managing vast volumes of data, is the licensing model. What you'll find is that most solutions on the market today are licensed on a thing called EPS, or events per second. And what this means is the more data you send to the actual technology, the more costly the solution becomes. This has a few challenges. So first of all, it's obviously very difficult to predict how much data you have at this point in time. But as we've discussed, these data volumes are increasing year on year, even day on day in sometimes. And what tends to happen over time is these solutions tend to get more and more expensive. So either you're paying more money, you have to budget more each year, or you start actually restricting the amount of logs you're sending into the solution to actually make sure the price isn't increasing. Now with that, obviously, what LogPoint's kind of philosophy here is a SIEM's only ever going to be as powerful as the data it contains. So we don't want to restrict our customers on the actual ingestion of data. So we license very differently based on the number of nodes or actually machines that send information. It doesn't matter how much data that is. In fact, the more data, the better, because the more powerful the solution will be. And as said, we have the UEBA module, which is over and above this, which provides this machine learning capability. That solution starts off as a minimum 250 entities, where an entity is a user on machine, and it's very cost effective, starting off around about £6,000 per year. And I guess this is where it gets interesting. So as I explained, what we did around about 6 months ago, we looked at certain public sector verticals and looked at where we can really align LogPoint technology, where we think it's relevant, where we think it actually add a significant amount of value. And obviously from our perspective, where we can actually see we can actually make a significant market share as well. And we looked at this and said, where can we actually align into these environments? So we looked at local governments, we looked at NHS, and we looked at universities. And we said, how can we make this relevant? How can we make it aligned to the kind of budgets that are going to be available, but also how do we make this predictable? And what we did is we aligned our enterprise core SIEM license to these verticals. And an enterprise license is an unlimited license. It's a license that doesn't have any restrictions on the number of nodes, on the amount of data you send to the solution. You can install the technology as many times as you like, and there's no restriction on the amount of users that use the technology at all. And what we did is we aligned this to a set price for the contract term, depending on what kind of trust it is. And you can see an example of that there. And obviously there is a multi-year options available for this as well. So if you buy a 3-year, there is a 5% discount on that. And if you buy a 5-year, there is a 10% discount aligned as well. And this makes, we hope, it very compelling from a commercial perspective, but also makes it that predictable thing that you know that once you buy the technology, it's going to meet your needs now and in the future with no additional costs aligned to that. And secondly, it's around obviously the installation as well. And one of the things we pride ourselves on is that when we actually work with yourselves, or we work with through our partner network with yourselves, we actually provide a service around installing the solution that's actually fit for purpose. And this isn't just about getting the solution operational. It's around making sure that as part of that, we take you on a journey to ensure that you learn how to use the system, and you can actually have an up and running and operation system that you know how to use when you leave site. So this entails numerous steps. It entails making sure we actually get the solution installed, configured. We go through an element of knowledge transfer as well as part of this engagement. And lastly, what we do is we actually ensure that our support teams are actually aligned to you to actually onboard you properly to our support function. And again, our support team are not just there to actually deal with any issues you might have. Obviously, we will do that. But if there are any questions, any ways you want to actually modify your solution, if you want to create a new dashboard or modify a search or create a report, you can always log a support ticket and they'll help you do that as well. So it is proper support for our customers as well. And the whole theory being here is we want to get you operational, but we want to get you using the solution to the best of its ability as well as part of this installation. So just the key principles. So simplification, make it cost effective, make it quick time to value, and make it very intuitive to use. No data limits, especially for the NHS. The more data, the better. There's no penalization on the amount of logs and the amount of data you're sending us. And world-class support. So providing support that's actually not just there to actually deal with any issues you might encounter, which hopefully won't be very many, but also making sure that support's there to actually help you in the day-to-day operations and get the most out of the solution. So I'll just jump in now to actually give you a very brief overview how the product works and how the architecture is put together. After which we'll dive into a demonstration so we can actually show you exactly what it looks like and how you can actually leverage the technology. So on this slide here, we can see on the left-hand side, we have our sources. So these are our firewalls, our two-factor authentication, our AV, our web security, our email security, but also things like our Windows environments, our desktops, our Linux servers, Office 365 and such like. So the first thing we need to do to actually leverage this technology is get the logs from those systems into the LogPoint environment. Typically, that's done by a syslog forwarding. But we can use various different means from SNMP to ODBC to flat file ingestion and to various APIs and such like we interface with. So in most cases, there is a very simple way of getting those logs into the LogPoint environment. Once it hits LogPoint, we have 3 core processes. So we have our normalization or collection engine, we have our storage environment, and we have our analytics engine as well. Now, each of those 3 components can be installed on the same device, or they can be installed on multiple devices. There's no restrictions to how many times you install the LogPoint solution. And this allows it to be extremely scalable. So you can put the normalization and collection points close to where they need to be. So if you've got multiple sites that you need to collect data from, you can put multiple collection points at each location. If you have multiple data centers, you might put different storage areas at each location to actually save you sending logs across the WAN links. And then our analytics engine can actually search across multiple storage arrays to actually pull this data into one place to actually easily view it. And also we can do the configuration from that as well. So from a sources perspective, this slide just gives some examples of the kind of things we interface with. And you can see obviously the typical security devices will already be pre-enabled. And we have over 430 or so now different connectors into different technologies across our environment. And you'll see things in there like Office 365 and such like, which are all fully integrated already. The other thing to say is if you do come across something that's not currently supported by LogPoint, which is becoming more and more rare nowadays, one of the things we say, again, which is I think is quite unique to LogPoint environments, is we tend to be driven more by our customer needs on how we actually develop new connectors and new integrations moving forward. Whilst our development team obviously are constant releasing new ones and upgrading existing ones, what we say to our customers is if you come across something we don't currently support, if you log a support ticket, providing it's a commercially available product we can share across the rest of our customer base, that will be actually integrated free of charge. The other thing to say around all this is, as I mentioned before, is with all these pre-built ones comes all the dashboards, all the use cases, alerts and reports that you need. We've seen other customers, people leverage those technologies. So it's very easy to get them integrated and up and running and relevant in a very short amount of time. So first thing we'll do is run things through our normalization engine. So as we pull logs from each of the devices into the LogPoint environment, the first thing we'll do with those logs is actually normalize them into the LogPoint taxonomy. So what we're doing here is we're taking log files, say from Windows Server saying username equals Bob, or from a ChatPoint file, say user ID equals Bob, and we'll always convert that to say user equals Bob. This ensures that whatever source, whatever log file we're actually collecting from, when we convert this into the actual LogPoint environment, it's always going to be referencing the same, we call it key value pair, so we can search across the same integer at all times. We do this on ingestion of data, so it means that we do all the heavy lifting, all the grunt work at the start of this. So when we come to storing the logs and you come to searching it, all that processing has already been done. It makes it a lot quicker to actually find the information you need. At the same time, we can also enrich the data as well. So we can take the log file and look at certain aspects of it, and then take that to actually kind of cross-reference it against third-party information. So that could be DHCP to find out the actual machine name that's using that IP address. It could be things like geolocation. It could be pulling information from a flat file to actually enrich the logs with some industry or some business specific or NHS specific information. In addition, we can also go to third parties and actually pull information from threat feeds as well. So we could actually take the IP address of an external source and look that up to see if it's actually a known command and control server, a known bad player, that we can actually then really actually add that information back into log files to give more context to that log as well. And the last thing we do here is actually route that log information. So this allows us to actually split the information out into different storage areas, different repositories. So we could split our firewall logs and our Windows logs into different places. Or if you have different logs with different retention times, so you have PCI data, for example, you have to store for a certain amount of time, maybe a couple of years, whereas your Windows logs you only need to store for 6 months. It's very easy to separate that data and then put different retention times on that information. So from a threat intelligence perspective for enrichments, as part of the typical installation, we would actually integrate the critical stack solution for threat intelligence and enriching those logs from the threat feed. Critical stack is free of charge, but there are many other ones we do interface with, some of which are chargeable, like Proofpoint and Recorded Future. We also integrate with things like sticks and taxi feeds as well, so actually allowing you to pull in lots of different information from various different sources. So the next thing we do is the information gets passed to our storage array. So we can have as many storage processors as you like, so one at each data center, for example, and each storage area can have as many repositories, so one for Windows, one for PCI, for example, and then each repository can have as many tiers of storage as you so wish. And this allows us to actually leverage different kind of types of storage for the types of data we're storing. So, for example, if we had, again, I'll use PCI as an example here, which we had to keep, say, for a 2-year period, we could say maybe that data has to be accessed every 10 minutes, for the first 30 days, but after that it's maybe every month, and after that maybe it's every 6 months. So we might actually leverage and store our data for the first 30 days on our very, very fast but slightly expensive storage system. But after that 30 days, we can migrate it to slightly slower but more cost-effective storage, and again migrate it down to lower storage, and then automatically delete the data. And this is all manageable inside the LogPoint platform. And then we have our advanced analytics engine. This is our front end, our interface into the LogPoint platform. So from here, we actually configure the solution. We also run the dashboards and actually look at the reports and such like as well, and run our searches. So this is a multi-user environment which is linked into AD, allowing us to provide very clear, specific role-based use of the solution, linking it down to groups and users. It's very easy to share information across the platform, and also to restrict access to certain repositories or certain information on a user-by-user basis. And again, once we dive into the demos in a second, we'll actually have a look exactly how that works. I'll just check if there's any questions. So no questions yet, but please do ask questions if there are anything that you need some more clarification around. Happy to answer anything as we go along. So I think we're ready now to just jump into the demo with Niels. So Niels, if I hand over to you.
Yes, thank you, Russ. Let me just share my screen and share again. And I hope you can see that all right. Russ, can you see it all right?
Yes, it's all there. It's all
okay, cool. So what you see here is the first thing that customers usually see when they log into LogPoint, and it is a dashboard. We all like a good dashboard, but the point to make is that you see actually quite a few dashboards that we have added in this demo environment, and all of these come pre-built with the platform. That's traditionally been an issue for SIEMs, that you don't see anything until you've done a lot of work. That's different with LogPoint. That was the idea, that for any device that you bring in, there's something we call a vendor package, and that comes with quite a few examples, such as this dashboard, some example alerts, often some reports, so there is something that you can start with. And when we look at this dashboard, it is a fairly commonly requested one, which is for Active Directory user management and user authentication. And that is one of the key data sources, although there are obviously lots of them, and I'll go through some examples of why you might want them. And in this case, you can easily see from the Windows logs who are the users that are logging in. Is there anyone failing their login? Is there someone locking themselves out, and so on? And then there's another dashboard where you can see who's adding anyone to an administrator group. Is there anyone that has a password set that's not supposed to be expiring? Is there someone adding users with $1 to hide them as a system user, and so on? So those dashboards are kind of high-level overview of the data that's flowing through your system, and you can take these and move them around. You can change the visualization on it if you want to see, okay, I want it as a radar, and so on. So there's a few options on how you make it look pretty, essentially. And you can also dive into the data underneath, and I'll do that in a second. So that's the first kind of use case that come from Windows logs, and there's a lot of information you can get from Windows event logs if that's the route you want to go down. But then the second big area of information that we like to look at is networking. And this is a fairly simplistic dashboard that works for pretty much any vendor, but you might get something more specific depending on the device that you bring in. And that's just an overview of where the connections are coming from and where they're going to, and maybe there's attempted traffic that gets blocked, it can show you that, or indeed the management of the devices where you can see login attempts and someone's making a policy change on the device and so on. And that's another key bit of information that can go as far as NetFlow logs and other kind of information that you might get from your firewalls. And one thing that we can do once we have all these log messages and all these statements of traffic between devices and so on, is, as Russell mentions, cross-reference that with an external threat feed that we are bringing in. So in this case, we're using Critical Stack, which is an open source one. There's also paid for ones like Proofpoint and Recorded Future. And indeed, we can bring in any sticks and taxi feed if that is a source of information that you have. And then you get an overview on how much of that do we see in your logs. So because we have all those log messages and all those IP addresses, for example, we can check every time we see an IP address anywhere in your logs, is that an IP address that's somewhere known in the world to be malicious? And that would be things like this, a malware command control server, and then tell you whether anyone's communicating with that. That's just one example of what we call enrichment. That's essentially correlating a log with something else, and that could be things like an LDAP lookup or a database table if you have information about machines like an asset management database and so on. But that's really useful to provide some additional context to those logs that might not be just in the log message. If you take it a step further, there's a lot of other data sources that you can bring in, specifically in that network security side. It could be intrusion detection systems. In this case, you can see we've got a vulnerability scanner that we bring in data from. And that's where the strength of a SIEM comes in. There's a lot of security tools out there that do their own processing and gather their own information, and some of them are really good and probably much better than what we could ever create. It's the same if you have something sophisticated like Darktrace that goes really deep on the network, but it will tell us that through the log messages, and therefore we can visualize it in here, so that in the end, not only do you have one place where you can see all of this, but also if you want to find something, you can search through all of it at the same time and maybe create correlations. If you see it in a Windows event log followed by your web proxy followed by a Wi-Fi access log or whatever else it might be. The list is endless of the information that you can bring in. It depends on what is of interest to you. It could be file access logs, it could be door access control systems, whatever else it might be, but it's good to have that in one place. So if we then look at a set of information like this, you can obviously do certain things with this. For example, you can kind of drill in and filter on the time frame. Ultimately, you will end up in the search platform if that's where you want to go, and that's really where you would start working with that data to find out what's happened. Just as an example, there is a search language up here that more powerful LogPoint users will want to understand. Sometimes that scares people away, but if I take that away, you can see that that's actually relatively straightforward how you create a search. Before I go into that, if you look at a log message, how that's held within the system, you can see here that there's the message kind of unnormalized, as in that's the raw message that came from the device. And then we turn that into these nice fields up here because we understand that log message. And that doesn't sound like much, but that is actually an awful lot of work to do if you wanted to do it yourself, because there's so many different log sources out there. And also, this is what allows us to search through multiple things at once. So if I do something like source address, that is a search that I can run against all my data, and then that comes back with all the log messages that contain this specific source address. And in this case, it's mostly Windows logs, but if you have that IP address appearing anywhere else in your log, whether that's your antivirus or your firewall or whatever else, it would come back at the same time, and you can start correlating between them in the queries as well. Also, you might notice these ones. That's also really useful when we understand the log message, which we do in a lot of cases, and certainly on Windows. You don't have to remember anymore what event ID 4625 is. We'll add those labels to it, and those labels you can then search for. So if you want to quickly see all the failed logins, you just do something like labels equals login and label equals fail, and then you get the result. And that's all the failed logins. This is obviously a lot of results. That's another nice thing about the SIEM. You can see how quickly all of that comes back. And then we unravel that just in case you want to look at it that way on the left-hand side, where you can see, okay, so there's 13 different values for workstations. Okay, so these are the ones with the failed logins. This is the different domains that we saw. And so on and so forth. So you can easily click on that without actually having to work on the search. And there's also some shortcuts like this where you can either look that up in the threat intelligence if that is an IP that you want to know information about, or you can exclude that to a DNS lookup and so on. So you can kind of start your queries like that. If you have a search like that, and let's do something like this. So you want to know, what times Bob has logged in. So you can get a nice overview about when Bob logs in, and it might be something very specific. Maybe he only logs in once a day. And you could then take this search result and then turn it either back into a widget on the dashboard, one of those nice graphs where you can see how things develop, or indeed create an alert rule out of that. So every time Bob logs in, you get an alert. And I'll come back to the alerts in a second. So that's how you would really go deep and understand the log messages and how they kind of happen one after another. But not everyone wants to go to that level. And there's still a lot of value in those log messages that other people might want to tap into, rather than having to log into specialist tools and so on. So there's something that we call search template, which kind of combines both that search as well as a dashboard. So if I take a look at a file access log, I just leave this like this star for now, that gives you an overview of everything that went on in your environment in terms of file access. Now, that obviously depends on log messages that actually contain this information, but you'd get that from Windows Event Logging, or maybe if you used Office 365, you get it from there. If you had a Dell filer, it would come from there, and so on. And that's all nice and well. And in this case, there's not that much going on, but you can already see down here that gets a bit tedious. And obviously, if you scroll that down, there's not much value in kind of seeing what everyone accessed. But what people usually want to know is, okay, so what has a specific user been doing? So you now have these fields available where you can just type that in and say, okay, I want to know everything that Mark has been doing. And then you get that. And that's obviously far more useful. So you can see that Mark has been writing files. He's been writing these PDF files, and also this one on a USB stick. And you get a nice overview on what that is on the USB stick and what machine he did it on. And all of this is customizable. So it's all powered by searches behind the scenes that you can change if you want to. But there's something there to start with, and then usually you refine that over time. I've spoken about alerts. So everything you've seen so far is really about monitoring your environment. You look at a dashboard, maybe you know how that's supposed to look. There's a spike, you start to think that's something wrong. Or you have to perform an investigation like this. You could give access to this to people that might not know they're using LogPoint. Maybe HR just needs to check something once an employee has left the company. So at the end of every employment, they just have a search template where they can put in the name and can see that the account has been deactivated. But that's all kind of proactive. So the next step naturally is then I want to be told when something happens, and that's where the alerts come in, and also the machine learning that I'll speak about in a second. So there are a lot of pre-built alerts that are predefined, and that would be 21 pages in this case. Mostly around specific devices, but also some general ones that just leave a trace in the log messages. And the point I always make is you don't want to go in and just turn everything on, because that's the problem that people have had with SIEMs. And then the next morning they come in and their alert inbox is full. There's no point in doing that. It's best to just have a look at what these alerts are, and an easy to understand example is in Office 365. There's a few predefined alerts like multiple successful logins from different countries, which is, very strange in Office 365 unless someone's starting to play with VPNs. So that might be something that you do want to know about. And ultimately, you pick alerts that mean something to you, and you know what to do when that happens, because otherwise there's no point in having an alert. And then they become your own alerts. You can make changes to them. And as an example, this one is one that comes with a Windows package. Anytime someone copies something onto your USB stick, you want to be informed about it. So if I click on that, and you can see that's really just a search, relatively simple. Removable storage, access write data. But if you turn that on in an environment where USB sticks are allowed, you'll just have tons of alerts for no reason. So this is just the starting point, and you'd probably start changing that a bit to maybe do something like user in blacklist. And that is a list that you can define in LogPoint or import or whatever else you want to do. And then maybe that alert starts making sense. Maybe only the people that are going to leave employment are on this list, and you want to know when they start copying lots of stuff onto a USB stick, and you can have thresholds on how often that needs to happen before you're alerted and so on. Also, once these alerts are triggered, you can have notifications with this little doorbell. So you can send an email, or you can run a shell script. You can call a REST API, maybe into something like Slack if you want to have this alert go external. And at the same time, they all end up in an incident management platform that is essentially built into LogPoint that looks a bit like this. So once an alert gets triggered, it can be owned by certain people, maybe the Windows machines. Their alerts are only owned by the Windows team. They can then be closed off and investigated and resolved and escalated, and they have different criticalities. You can always click on View Data and dive straight back into that search platform where you can actually work out what are the specific event log messages that led to that alert. And I'll come back to the alerts at the end with the machine learning. I just wanted to briefly talk about reporting, which is kind of the last big thing that a SIEM is supposed to be doing. And you can see some examples here in my inbox. That's are reports that had been pre-generated. If I look at this, it's what you'd expect. There's a bit of branding behind it, and then it's a list of contents, and maybe the information that otherwise is in a dashboard is sort of in a paper-based result like this, depending on what you need. Point to make is there are, again, a lot of pre-built reports, if I look at those. For different categories of information. So this is stuff that comes with Office 365, for example. That's very operational. It's the same with something like this, which is for a firewall. But then there's also a compliance package that comes with the product that has certain reports that are more kind of management style, targeted at specific regulations, things like NIST and GDPR and ISO. And they're ultimately still the same information, but it might be presented in a slightly different way. Final point to make is if you click on one of those, you can see how they're actually defined. It is really straightforward, which is another strength of LogPoint. It's just another search. So you can even go through your search history and say, okay, I've done user Bob, user login. I want that now on my report. I want it in this panel, and I want it that wide, and then that just becomes part of this report and gets generated. And you can see that there's a few other searches in there, like what's being copied onto a USB stick, and is there anyone that logged in several times from a different country, and so on. And they're all kind of just elements of this report. And if something like that interests you and you want to work more with it, you can just take that and search it in the platform and see what you get back and work with it and make it your own. So that's why it's really useful to have all these things predefined, because it gives you a starting point of what other people have been looking for, and you can start making changes. Maybe you want to exclude all your domain administrators, or you just want to have it for a certain network and so on. It's all just part of that search. And that's essentially the functionality of the core SIEM. It's about collecting all those log messages. It's about translating them into a single format, making them retrievable really quickly and easily, and then giving you information on top of it through the dashboards, through the search templates, through incidents and alerts that get raised, and the reports that are built on top of it. That is, really useful, and a lot of customers buy LogPoint for this. But the question that usually arises is, okay, that's all good, but I kind of need to create these alerts, for example. I need to know in advance what I'm looking for. And that's true. And that's why people struggle to find employees with enough experience to do this kind of thing. And that's also why we've started introducing UEBA, which is the machine learning, the entity behavioral analytics, which is a separate license, which is why I always keep it to the end. But it actually nicely integrates throughout the platform. It's just another level of intelligence on top of the log messages that you see. So in this case, we've analyzed these 120 million events. Why don't we create some behavioral models on what's normal, and then tell you when something deviates from that normality? And you can see here that there's a few anomalies that we found, and some of them we currently consider actively risky. And then at the bottom, you can see the machine learning models that got triggered, and there's hundreds of them. And I'll show you some examples. That's against that log data. And you can see what the different categories are that this falls into when they get triggered, where we think this might be an indication of something. These are the stages of the kill chain, where nowadays it's not as easy as give me an alert if someone communicates on the Samba port externally, because this stuff happens all the time. It's about multiple log sources coming together over a period of time. Often they're low and slow, where there's just something not quite right. And that's what I hear from most customers. They have this nagging feeling that there's something going on, but they just can't find it and they don't know how to look for it. So if we look at the detail behind this, you can see this here for the period of a day. There's certain models that got triggered at different times of the day. So there's some low-risk events and some high-risk events. And on the left-hand side, you can see the entities, the users that you are monitoring. And there are some that have a low-risk score and some have a high-risk score. So if we filter just on the high-risk events, you'll see that Joshua Newman stands out. He has a risk score of 98. That risk score is not something that someone has to sit down and determine. And that's another challenge that SIEMs and UEBA often have, where someone needs to constantly tune this. This is essentially self-learning, and that risk score is based on how far removed is this from what this user normally does and what any other user like him normally does. And then on the right-hand side, you get the timeline of what happened. So you can see that Joshua worked at an unusual time, which doesn't sound terribly important. But it's a good illustration of where that is different to a regular SIEM alert. Because firstly, you need to remember to set an alert for this. And secondly, you'd have to work out what do you actually want to alert on. Is it anywhere between 9 and 5:30? And then Joshua is already one of those exceptions. He always works late. In this case, yes, it is unusual that he's working early, but that's only unusual for him. So already you'd either end up with lots of false positives for people like Joshua, you'd end up with a rule set that's so broad that it doesn't trigger and there's no value in it. Or you get lots of false positives because it's people like Joshua. Also, do you want an alert for that in your inbox every morning? Everyone that worked at a time that was unusual? Probably not. They might have just been sleepless or went on holiday or whatever else. But it is an important piece of information that might just be one of those many needles in the haystack that illustrates something's going on. So in this case, that in itself will have elevated his risk score a little bit, but probably not over a threshold where it would lead to an actual alert. The second thing that then happens is pretty much at the same time, as you can see here, and it comes from a completely different log source, and that's really where the strength of a SIEM comes in. There's lots of tools that go really deep on the network, on security and devices, and that's all great. And the SIEM is about the bit that brings it all together. So you can see from a web proxy log in this case that Joshua sent a lot of data using a post request. And that's really a strange way of transferring data because no one really attaches 1.3 gigabytes to their webmail account. And it's also unusual because he's never done it. And you can see the averages here. At the same time, no one else has ever done it. So this is vastly unusual. And that is something that would otherwise be hidden in your log messages and you probably never realize. And how would you create an alert for this? You don't know how much people usually transfer using a post request. So it's that sequence of events over a period of time that then leads to this risk score. And that is something that you can work with really easily. There's just a LogPoint alert that is current risk score over 90, maybe let me know. And you can then be pretty certain that there was something going on at that time. You can even do this from the perspective of, let's say, a share. So in this case, this share has a high risk score, A, because the user with a high risk score was active in it, and B, he was so active in there that he could access it 38 times an hour, where he normally would have accessed it about kind of 1.1 times. And that's really the idea behind UEBA. It all relies on the log data being in place underneath. You can't have UEBA without a SIEM. And there's a lot of data and information you can proactively get out of your logs in a SIEM. But at the same time, it's nice to have this extra layer of intelligence on top that runs these machine learning models to see what's unusual and then maybe tells you about things that you didn't know were going to happen. That is pretty much all I wanted to show you. I hope it gives you an idea of where log messages can finally give you value and make sense, and how the core SIEM compares with the kind of machine learning in UEBA.
Thank you very much, Nils, and thank you for that overview. So guys, hopefully that's given you a good insight into the LogPoint solution and hopefully how it could apply to your environments. We'll open up for questions now. We've got another 6 minutes or so. So we've had, I think, 6 or so questions, which I'll read through now. But if you have anything else you would like to ask, please use the Q&A button to ask those now. So Nils, I've answered quite a few of these, which I'll run through in a sec, but there is one which I wanted you to jump on if possible. So the question is there RBAC, so certain groups only get access to certain data sets or dashboard results, etc.?
Yes, so and thank you for that question, because maybe I should have mentioned it. So that's role-based access within LogPoint, and it's you can see it actually. Well, I've stopped sharing the screen, but you might have noticed in certain places there's a user in the top right corner, and I've also talked about it when there's alerts. So definitely you can have multiple users that use LogPoint. Usually that's integrated through LDAP with Active Directory. And you log in and you might only see certain sets of devices. You can filter it on a lot of things as to what people have access to in terms of IP addresses maybe, or as I say, device groups, and even data storage volumes and all sorts. And then your searches could only run against what you are allowed to see. The other point to make, and that's quite important, especially in this context, is that you can use something called data privacy, which allows you to encrypt certain fields as they are held in the platform. So anyone that accesses a log that contains that information would essentially see gobbledygook for that field. So you can declare something like the patient ID field is a data privacy field. So if they come across that in the search, they can click on it in the platform and select, I want access to this. And that goes into kind of a 4 eyes process where someone else needs to grant them access for a certain period of time, and that then allows them to actually view the payload, the data that's behind it, and maybe only for a certain period of time. So that's how you can get control over any sensitive data that might be held within the platform.
Fantastic. Thank you, Niels. So there are a few more questions. Let me just run through those as well. The question here is there an online demo? So we have a recording of the demo that Niels has just presented, which we can share. But as I've said here as well, if anyone does want a more tailored one-to-one demonstration, we're happy to jump on a separate webinar and actually run that for you as well. So just reach out, and happy to do that. Next question here is there a list or directory of what kind of data can be imported into LogPoint from a particular vendor? Yes, we have a list on our website, and we'll also share after the call a more detailed PDF file which details the majority of the actual collectors that we have configured and some of the things you can do with that. We also have a really useful document around use cases, which kind of gives you some examples of typical things that we see our user base utilizing the solution for, which should give you a good idea how you can leverage the technology. Next one here is there an on-prem version of LogPoint, and how does the licensing managed? Sorry, I missed the initial overview. Okay, yeah, just to reiterate, I guess, so obviously the LogPoint solution, it comes as actually we provide an image of the solution. It's actually based on a hardened version of Ubuntu Linux. So that image we give you can be installed on dedicated hardware inside your environments on premise. It can be installed onto virtual environments, but it also can be installed into AWS and Azure if required. So as I explained, the license, the typical license is based on the number of nodes that send information to LogPoint, and you can still buy that for example, if you have a small environments, maybe of 50 nodes, which is our starting pack, which retails for around about £12,900 per year. But for the NHS, as explained, we've actually leveraged the enterprise license, which is usually what we use for large enterprise customers, and is obviously quite expensive usually. But we've given significant discounts aligned to that for the NHS, which allows you to actually basically install LogPoint as an unrestricted license. So for the core SIEM product, there is literally no restrictions on how much data, how many nodes, how many times you install the product, or how many users. So you can actually use it as you wish into your entire environment. And as that environment grows, it will not increase in price inside the contract term. And it allows you to actually maybe leverage it for things that you might not initially have thought of, maybe test environments and such like as well. Next question here is, how much additional cost is the machine learning? So the UEBA module is an add-on module over and above the core SIEM license. So as a minimum, we typically recommend our customers take a 250 entity, which is our base license for UEBA. And an entity is a machine or a user. So that's usually enough to actually be a good starting point to cover the high risk users. So things like admins and senior managements, in addition to those machines like the core asset machines on your environments. And that retails for around about £6,000 per year for that full functionality. I think that's covered that one as well. Contract terms. So the license is licensed as a subscription model on 1 year multiples. For the core SIEM solution, there is a 5% discount for a 3-year upfront purchase and a 10% for a 5-year upfront purchase. I think we should have another one. So another question is coming, is this on-premise or hosted? How would you say you differ from Splunk, SIEM and such like? So this is a piece of software which we provide, as I said, as an image incorporating the OS and such like, which is one of the reasons why we can actually obtain EL3 plus certification, because we're actually looking after the whole stack of the solution. So that is, being an image, can be installed, as we said, on premise or in the cloud under AWS or Azure. We don't provide a SaaS service at the moment, but this is a software solution you can install in the cloud. Okay, any more questions for anyone else? And thank you for your feedback, everyone, as well. It's really useful. What I'll do as well, let me just share this. So hopefully you can see that as well. So there's my contact details here. So should you have any questions afterwards, please do just drop me a line and I'll answer those as soon as I can. I'll also, provided we've obviously got your contact details, I'll send through a brief email following the presentation, which will contain things like the review we've done against the Data Security and Protection Toolkit, also a link to the demos, some use cases, and some other value collateral that you might need. Would be really valuable to follow up again one-on-one. So we'll either be in touch or via the partner you're actually engaging with, and to make sure that we're actually got everything you need from a LogPoint perspective. But I hope that today was useful. I hope it provided the information and insights you needed to actually look at this kind of technology and see where it might be relevant. And I look forward to speaking to everyone soon. So thank you very much, and thank you, Nils.